They called the moon the maw, though that was our word for it, not theirs. The veil did not name places. A place was something you held or something you lost, and it did not need a name to be either. I learned that early, the way you learn everything inside a War-Creche, with my back against cold stone, and the taste of my own blood going thick at the root of my tongue. I had worn a uniform for 31 years before they took me. Most of those years I spent turning frightened boys into men who could stand in a line and not break. Drill instructor first. Then the senior man they sent forward when a unit had stopped being a unit and needed reminding what it was. I was never the smartest soldier in any room, and I was never the strongest. What I was good at was simple. I could take a scared, half-formed thing and teach it to hold its place when every nerve it owned was screaming at it to run. I didn't know yet that this single skill was the only reason I would live out the year. The Reach took our frontier the way the sea takes a sandbar. Not in one blow, just relentless, patient grinding until there was nothing left above the waterline to stand on. By the time they overran my station, I had already buried most of the people I'd spent a decade building. I remember the last of them, a corporal named Hale with his hand around my collar telling me to get up, and then the world filled with a sound like a mountain clearing its throat. And when I woke I was in a cage, and Hale was nowhere, and the air smelled of wet iron and something underneath it that I would come to know better than I ever wanted to. The veil smelled like that always, like blood that had been kept too long and then warmed. They were bigger than a man and built lower, heavy through the shoulder, able to drop onto 4 limbs and cover ground faster than anything that size had any right to. Their eyes threw the light back at you, flat gold coins in the dark. They did not speak so much as work the air, a low grinding undervoice that the translator collar they'd bolted to me rendered into clipped, contemptuous fragments. And they sent the way we read a face. Fear, to them, was not a feeling you hid. It was a thing you wore, loud as a flag, and they despised it the way a man despises a coward, except that to them every living thing that was not veil was a coward by definition, and most things that were. They did not take prisoners for mercy. There is no word for mercy in their undervoice. I have looked. They took me because a thing that breathes is a thing that can be used, and the wetmaster of the maw had a use for me. I do not remember much of the journey there, and I have decided that is a mercy of a kind, the only one that place ever gave me. There were holds. There was cold, and the undervoice grinding overhead, and the long stretches where they forgot a thing like me needed to eat. I remember the moon mostly as a shape that grew in a viewport, a dead gray rock with a scab of structure on its dark side, no lights to speak of, because the veil do not waste light on a place whose only purpose is teeth. When they hauled me down into it, the corridors were carved close and low, built for things that move on 4 limbs when they hurry, and everywhere was that same smell, blood kept too long and warmed, soaked so deep into the stone that 2 centuries of it had become the smell of the rock itself. I understood before anyone told me that whatever this place made, it made by subtraction. His name, I learned later, was Sore. The cubs feared him the way you fear weather. He was old for a veil, his hide gone the gray of dead coral, one eye milky where something had raked it long ago and lived just long enough to regret it. He ran the creche, and a War-Creche is not a school. It is a culling ground with a roof on it. Here is how they make a soldier the veil way. They breed cubs by the litter and they raise them in pits, and at intervals they hold what the collar called the counting. The cubs are ranked by kills, not skill, kills. The strong eat well and the weak eat the strong's leavings, and at the counting the lowest in the rank are culled, dragged out and opened up in front of the rest as a lesson, and the lesson is this: there is no floor beneath you. There is only the next one down, and you had better make sure it is somebody else. That is the whole of their pedagogy. That is how the Reach made the army that ate my frontier. Sore's use for me was simple, and I'll give him this, it was clever. A litter of cubs that has only ever killed each other has only ever fought things shaped like itself. The first time such a creature meets prey that does not look like prey, that stands upright and looks back at it, it hesitates. And a soldier who hesitates the first time is a soldier who dies the first time. So Sor would give his newest litter a thinking enemy to blood themselves on before they ever left the moon. He would throw the human in the pit. They expected it to last an afternoon. I remember the floor of that pit, sand over stone, dark in patches where the sand had not been enough. I remember the smell. And I remember the litter, 11 of them, half my size but not for long, ranged along the far wall watching me with those flat gold eyes while Sor's undervoice ground out of the collar. Run, soft thing. Make it worth our cub's teeth. I did not run. That was the whole of it in the end. Everything that came after grew out of that one thing I did on the first day, which was nothing. I stood. I put my back to the wall so nothing could come at it, and I set my feet the way I'd set them 1,000 times on a parade ground with my voice flaying some recruit who'd never been hit and didn't yet know he could take it, and I waited. Prey runs. Prey shows its back and its terror and gives a predator the chase its blood is built for. I gave them a wall and a pair of eyes, and the patience of a man who has already buried everyone he loved and finds, to his surprise, that he is not in a hurry to join them. The biggest cub came first. They always come in rank order. I didn't know that yet, but I'd have bet on it. It came low and fast and certain, and I did the one thing 31 years had taught my hands to do without asking my brain. I didn't meet its strength. I moved off its line and let it commit, and I drove my heel down on the joint of its trailing leg with everything I had. The crack of it went around that pit like a shot. The cub went over screaming, a sound I felt in my teeth. And then I was on it, and a man with a wall at his back and nothing left to lose can do a great deal of damage to a knee in a very short time. And then I stopped. That was the part they could not parse. I had it. I had its throat under my forearm and a fist drawn back, and every Vale instinct in that pit was bracing for the kill that would settle the rank, and I did not make it. I let it up. I stepped back to my wall, and I let the broken thing drag itself away, and I watched 11 sets of gold eyes try to understand what they had just seen and fail. Prey does not spare the predator. There is no room in their world for the idea. A thing that could kill you and chooses not to is not weak. They are not stupid. They could see it was not weakness. But it is not anything they have a name for. I had stepped outside the only story they knew, the one where the floor is always somebody's throat. And in the silence after, 11 young predators looked at the strange, upright thing against the wall with something that was not yet respect, but was the soil respect grows in. They did not come again that first day. That was its own kind of strange, a Vale litter that has tasted a fight, and then simply stops is a litter doing something its instincts forbid. And I think even then, bloodied and braced against my wall, I understood I had cracked something open. The light in that pit never changed. There was no day or night down there. Only the long gray sameness, and the cubs ranged along the far wall in a loose arc, watching me, shifting their weight, the broken one dragging itself in slow circles and the rest pretending not to watch it suffer. I stayed on my feet until my legs would not hold me. Then I slid down the wall and kept my eyes open, and the cubs kept theirs open, and we passed the hours like that, predator and prey both refusing to do the one thing the other was built to expect. I have stood a great many watches in my life. That was the longest. That night I lay against the stone with my hands still shaking, and I made a decision that I have never been able to fully explain then or now. I was going to die on that moon. I knew that. There was no version of the future where I walked off it. But I had spent my whole life doing one thing, and I found I would rather spend my last weeks doing it than cowering. There was raw material in that pit. 11 frightened. Vicious, half-made things that had never once in their lives been shown, that there was any way to be in the world other than alone with your teeth. I was going to make soldiers out of them, real ones, not the Vale kind. I did not yet understand what that would do. The big one I had broken, they numbered their cubs until the cubs earned a name with a kill, and his number rendered through the collar as a sound like Drek. That one I expected to come back at me in the night to finish what rank demanded. He didn't. He watched. By the second day, he was watching me instead of the others, and a thing that watches you instead of fearing you is a thing you can work with. His leg healed crooked. He should have been culled for it. Instead, I started using him, because a sergeant is not the strongest man in the platoon. He is the one the others will follow, and Drek had been first in rank before I broke his knee, and the other 10 still measured themselves against him out of habit. I just had to teach him to spend that on something other than himself. I gave him a name. I called him Sergeant. The collar didn't have a word for it in their undervoice, so it stayed in my language, an alien sound, and he wore it like a wound at first and then like a hide. Within a month, the other cubs were making that human sound at him too, low in their throats, Sergeant, and I understood that I had done something to that litter that the Veil had never done in 10,000 years of culling, which was give one of them a thing to be that was not a number waiting to drop. This is the part where I should tell you it was a triumph. It was not. It was the grind. It was weeks and then months of the hardest, ugliest, most thankless work I have ever done, and I have stood on a lot of parade grounds. They had no instinct to cover one another. Their every reflex said the cub beside you is the one you must outlast. I drilled it out of them an inch at a time. I taught them to move on a line, to hold a flank, to put their bodies between a threat and the smallest of them, and every single lesson cut directly against 10,000 years of breeding. And most days I thought it was hopeless, and some days a cub I had spent a week reaching would revert in an instant and put its teeth into another over a scrap of meat, and I'd have to start the whole climb again from the bottom. The day it turned, I remember exactly. I had 2 of them working a line, Sergeant and a heavy cub had taken to calling anchor, and I was running them against a third who'd agreed to play the threat, drilling the simplest thing in the world and the hardest thing I ever taught. When the one beside you commits, you do not watch him, you move. You put your body where his blind side is and you make his mistakes survivable. We had failed it 40 times. 40. Every instinct in them said, let him fall, his fall is your rank. And on the 41st run, Sergeant overcommitted, left himself open, dead to rights, and anchor moved. Without the signal. Without me. He read the gap and he filled it, and he covered another cub's mistake with his own body, the single most unveil act I had witnessed in all my months down there, and he did it like it was nothing, like it was obvious, like some door had come quietly open in him and he'd simply walked through. I made them run it again so they wouldn't see me have to turn my face away. You do not let recruits watch you feel things. It is one of the first rules and one of the hardest. But I felt it. After 31 years, I knew exactly what I was looking at. I was looking at a unit. But predators learn. God, do they learn. Faster than any recruit I ever had. Once a thing went in, it stayed. And there is a thing that happens when you ask the impossible of the young and they find they can do it. They start to want to. They started waiting for me in the mornings. They started moving without being told, finding their places, watching my hands for the small signals I'd taught them so they wouldn't need the collar's noise. And Soar's pit, which had been a culling ground, became, very quietly and without anyone above us understanding it yet, something else. There was a runt. There's always a runt. Number 19, smallest of the litter, born last and least, the one the counting was built to grind off the bottom. By every law of that creche, 19 should have died in the first month. He was too small to win a fight and too smart to lose one badly, which in a Veil creche is just a longer way to die. I should have let him go. A drill sergeant learns early that you cannot save the one who is going to drown. You save the ones you can and you carry the rest, and the carrying is the price. I didn't let him go. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't kindness, not at first. It was use. 19 was small and quick and frightened, and a frightened thing notices everything, every change in the air, every footfall in the corridor above, every shift in the rotation of the instructors. He couldn't fight, so I made him watch. I made him my scout, my eyes, and I taught him that being the smallest was not a sentence but a posting, that there was a thing only he could do, and the day 19 understood that, the day that little half-killed runt understood he had a job and a place and people who needed him to do it well, something in him stood up that I don't think had ever stood up in any Veil that ever lived. He stopped flinching. He started carrying himself like he mattered, because to us he did. The Vale have no word for the lowest having worth. I'd looked for that one too. There was a morning 19 saved all of us and never knew how close it had been. The instructors had taken to rotating an older litter through the next pit over, near to shipping out, and one of them had gotten loose in the corridors, a half-grown Vale with a kill count and nothing left to learn but how to spend it. It came down our access shaft in the gray hours, meaning to blood itself on something smaller, the way they all did. 19 heard it. Heard it 3 turns out. When it was still just a wrongness in the air, the rest of us would have slept straight through, and he had us up and on the line before the thing cleared the last bend. 11 cubs ranked and waiting in the dark where it had expected 11 cubs asleep. It took one look at that silent line, and it did the smart thing, the only thing its instincts would allow, which was leave. 19 had turned away a killer without spilling a drop, with nothing but a pair of good ears and the knowledge that he had a job and people counting on him to do it well. He didn't strut about it afterward. He found me, pressed his head against my arm for half a second the way he'd started doing, and went back to watching the dark. The least of them. The one the counting had been built to grind off the bottom. Then came the counting, and I learned the price after all. I had known it was coming. 19 had told me, heard it in the corridors, the instructors gathering, the smell of it, he said, the smell that came before. I had drilled the litter until they could hold formation in their sleep, until 11 cubs moved like one animal, and I had let myself believe, the way a tired man does, that I had bought them out from under the old law. I was wrong. The counting did not care what we had built. The counting cared about kills, and my cubs had not been killing each other, which was the whole point of everything I'd done, and which meant that by the only arithmetic the more recognized, every one of them ranked at the bottom now, and Soar's instructors came down into the pit to take the lowest by the old reckoning. And the lowest by the old reckoning was a cub I'll call Sella, because she'd earned a name by then in our way if not in theirs, quiet, steady. The one who always took the hard end of the line without being told. They took her in front of us. I tried to stop it. I put myself between her and the instructor, a younger Vale named Vesk who enjoyed the work, and Vesk broke 3 of my ribs with one swat and held me down in the sand with 1 foot while it was done, and made me watch because that was the lesson, that was always the lesson. There is no floor beneath you. I watched. I had no choice. And the litter watched too. 11 of them frozen at the formation halt. I drilled into them, holding, because I had taught them to hold, and they did not yet know there was anything else I might one day tell them to do. When it was over and Vesk had gone back up, I knelt in the sand with my broken ribs grinding, and I did the only thing left to me. I gathered what was left of Sella, and I would not let them eat it, which is what the counting required, and I dug with my hands in the corner of that pit in the dark, and I buried her. The cubs watched that too. A Vale does not bury its dead. The dead are meat or they are nothing. They had no concept for what I was doing, kneeling in the dirt over a thing that could no longer be of any use, weeping the way an old man weeps, which is quietly and without much water. And when I was done, Sergeant came and stood over the place beside me, and after a while the others came too, and 11 young predators stood in a loose ring over a patch of disturbed sand and were silent, and I understood that I had taught them the last and most dangerous thing of all. I had taught them to count their dead. That is the thing the Vale never understood about us in the end. They thought we were soft because we grieved. They thought grief was weakness made visible, a flag of cowardice, a thing to be despised and bred out. They were wrong, and it killed them, because a creature that counts its dead is a creature that knows the dead are worth something, and a creature that knows that is a creature that will, when the moment finally comes, spend itself without limit to keep from adding to the count. The Vale fought to avoid the floor. My cubs would learn to fight for each other. There is no comparison. One of those armies will always, in the end, break the other. Soar knew something was wrong before he knew what. You cannot run a creche for 2 centuries and not develop an instinct for it. The litters that came out of his pits were savage and divided and afraid of him, exactly as designed, and this litter was none of those things. They were quiet. They were ordered. They watched the instructors come and go, and they did not cringe. And a cub that does not cringe is a cub that has lost its proper fear. And a Vale overseer can read the loss of fear off the air like smoke from a fire he cannot yet see. He started coming down himself, the old gray killer, standing at the rim of the pit with his one good eye and breathing us in, and I would feel the litter want to bristle, and I would give them the smallest signal, hold, and they would hold, and Soar would breathe in 11 young predators holding perfectly still under the eye of the thing that ruled their world, and not one of them flinching, and I watched him not understand it and hate that he didn't. He spoke to me once near the end, came down to the rim alone in what passed for the dead hours and worked the air at me, and the collar grounded into my language a beat behind the way it always did, so his contempt arrived slightly stale. "What have you made?" he said. Not a question, the Vale do not really ask. They do not fight. They do not climb. You have unmade them. I looked up at the old gray killer with his one milk eye, and I told him the truth, because there was no longer any reason not to. I told him I had unmade nothing. I'd made them into something his kind had never seen and could not build, because building it required a thing the Vale had bred out of themselves so long ago they'd forgot it was ever there to lose. He stood a while breathing me in, reading the air for the fear he knew was on me. And it was on me. I had been afraid every hour of every day on that rock, and he found it, and it comforted him, and that was his mistake. He thought the fear was the whole of me. He could not conceive that a thing might be afraid and stand anyway, afraid and useful, afraid and unbroken. To a Vale those words do not belong in the same breath. "You will watch them remember what they are," he said, and he turned, and he climbed back into the dark. He was right that they would remember. He was only wrong about what they would remember being. A riot he would have known how to answer. That's what he was braced for, I think, in those last weeks. For the litter to break, to go feral, to come up the walls in a screaming mob the way a poorly culled litter sometimes did, and that he could have crushed in an afternoon and called it routine. Motion he understood. Fury he understood. He was a predator to the marrow, and his whole life had taught him that the dangerous animal is the one that bares its teeth and charges. What he could not read, what no Vale could read, was stillness with intent behind it. A line of young soldiers standing silent and ranked and waiting was a thing his instincts had no file for. It read to him as wrong, as cold, as a held breath that would not let out, and it frightened him in a place he could not name, and a frightened thing makes mistakes. Even an old one, even a king. He decided to kill me. He could not simply do it, that was the thing. He'd realized too late that the human was the axle the whole litter turned on, and he was afraid that if he came down and gutted me in the sand the way he wanted to, he'd get his riot at last. 11 cubs coming off the wall at once, and even a Vale overseer thinks twice about 11 of his own kind with the fear bred out of them. So he was clever, the way he'd been clever at the start. He would make it accounting. He would frame my death in the only ritual the cubs had ever known, and he would make them watch their human be culled the way they'd watched Sella. And he believed, I am certain he believed, that the old law was deeper in them than anything I could have written over it in a few months, that when they saw the strong take the weak they would remember what they were, and the human's strange spell would break, and his creche would be his again. He came down into the pit himself for it. That was his pride and his last mistake. Soar and Vesk and 2 more instructors, 4 full-grown Vale into the pit, and the rim above lined with more, and the undervoice grinding out of every collar at once so the whole litter would hear it. The soft thing has made you soft. Watch it culled and remember the floor. I want to tell you what that moment was, because I have lived it 10,000 times since in the dark, and I have never gotten it wrong. The instructors spread out. Vesk came for me first, the way he had before, certain, the broken-ribbed human already half-killed and waiting. And the litter, my litter, 11 of them, Sergeant on the right where I'd put him and 19 small and forgotten at the end of the line, the litter did not move. That was what broke Soar, not violence, the opposite of it. They held, ranked, silent, every cub in its place, gold eyes fixed and flat, not one of them coming off the wall, not one of them cringing, not one of them doing any single thing a Vale cub had ever done in the history of that pit. They simply stood, in the formation I had drilled into them until it lived below thought, and they waited. And I watched the old gray king look down the line of them and finally understand what he was looking at. And I watched the understanding land in him like cold water, because a riot he had been ready for, and what he had instead was 11 soldiers waiting for an order. The instructors stopped. Even Vesk, 3 feet from me with murder in its haunches, stopped, because a predator reads the room off the air, and the air in that pit had gone wrong in a way none of them had ever smelled. And 4 killers who had never in their lives hesitated stood frozen in the silence of 11 young things that had decided, all together and without a sound, that they were done being afraid. I got to my feet. It cost me. I put my hand flat against the cold stone and pushed myself up against the grind of 3 broken ribs, and I stood the way I'd stood on the first day, feet set, back to the wall that had kept me alive, and I looked down the line of them, sergeant, steady. The others, holding, little 19 at the end, who should have died in the first month and had instead become the eyes of the best unit I ever built, and I gave them the word. It was a small word. It was the word I'd started every drill with for 31 years, the word that meant the waiting is over, the word 1,000 recruits had heard me bark across 1,000 cold mornings, and it came out of me now in a pit on an alien moon barely louder than a breath. Because I knew they were listening for it, because I had taught them to listen for nothing else. Begin. I will not dress up what happened next. It was not clean and it was not bloodless, and it was over faster than it takes to tell. 11 came off that wall as one animal, and they did not fight the way the Vale had bred them to fight, each for itself, all teeth and rank. They fought the way I had taught them, together, covering, driving the 4 instructors into the angles where 4 cannot use their size, and it was the most terrible and the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Vesk went down under 3 of them before it had finished turning toward the sound. The 2 younger instructors broke for the wall and did not make it, and Soar, old Soar, the Gray King, who had ruled that moon for 2 centuries on the certainty that the floor was always someone else's throat, Soar met Sergeant. The cub whose knee I had broken on the first day and whose name I had given in my own tongue, and Sergeant did not break, and did not run, and did not stop, and at the end the old king learned the same lesson he had taught 1,000 litters, which is that there is no floor beneath you. There was only the next one down, and for the first time in his long life, it was him. We lost 2. I want that counted because I taught them to count it. We lost a cub called Turne, who I'd made my anchor on the left, who held his place a half-second too long covering the others, and paid for it the way the man who holds the line always pays. And we lost 19. The runt, the smallest, the one who should have died in the first month and had stolen 6 more out of the jaws of that place by being clever and useful and brave. When the rim opened up and the guards above began firing down into the pit, it was 19 who saw it first, because seeing things first was the whole of what he was, and it was 19 who put himself in front of me, the broken-ribbed old human he decided somewhere along the way was his to guard, and took what was meant for the back of my head. He was very small. He did not weigh much when I gathered him up. He looked at me with those flat gold eyes already going dim, and I swear before whatever god runs a place like that, I swear he understood that he had done his job, that he had been the smallest and the least and he had been the one who mattered in the end, and that there is no Vale that ever lived who got to die knowing that, and he did, because a human had taught him there was such a thing to know. We took them all. I'll spare you the long version. A creche full of Soar's other litters, raw and savage and divided, against one unit that moved like a single hand. It was not even a contest, and it should have been, and that is the whole of it. The thing the Reach had spent 2 centuries breeding, the lone killer who outlasts the cub beside him, met the thing I had spent a few months building, the soldier who would die for the cub beside him, and the second thing ate the first thing alive. By the time it was done, the moon was ours, and a great deal more after that, but those are other stories and not mine to tell, because by then they had outgrown me, which is the only thing a man in my trade can ever really want, and the worst. There were other litters in that creche, 3 of them, raw and savage and exactly as Sore had built them, and when the pit broke open they did what their breeding demanded. They came at us, and at each other, a churning mob of teeth and rank with no line and no center and no reason behind any of it. My 11 met them as one body. I have tried many times since to describe what that looked like, and I always fail, so I will only say this. It was the difference between a riot and an army, made visible, in the worst light God ever poured into a room. The savage ones outnumbered us 3 to 1, and it did not matter, because numbers are nothing to a mob and everything to a line. By the end, the survivors among them were not fighting us. They were following us, falling in behind Sergeant, because a young thing with no reason of its own will always, in the end, attach itself to the first creature that hands it one. That is how it spread in the years after. Not conquest. Just one unit and then more, and the slow, quiet contagion of being shown there was another way to be. I buried 19 in the corner of the pit next to Sella with my hands in the dirt, the way the Veil never did and my cubs now always would. Sergeant stood over the place beside me, the way he had the first time, and the others came, and we were silent. There were more of them now. Word travels. There are creches all across the Reach where the young ones have started standing strange and quiet under the eyes of their masters, and the masters, who could break a riot, do not know what to do about a held breath, and the count of the dead grows, and somewhere down the line of all of it is an old human, and a patch of disturbed sand on a moon that nobody named. I am old now, and I will not see the end of what I started, and that's fine. I never expected to walk off that moon, and I have done a great deal more than walk. People ask me sometimes how a half-killed prisoner turned a litter of alien killers into the unit that broke a creche, and they want it to be a thing about humans, about how we're tougher or smarter or harder to kill than the things out there in the dark, and it isn't. We're not. I've seen what's out there, and we are none of those things. Here is the only answer I have. The Veil spent 10,000 years teaching their young how to kill, and not once, not one single time, did they teach them why. They built an army of orphans who fought to avoid the floor, and they never understood that a creature with nothing to fight for will always, in the end, break before a creature that has something to fight for. They were ready for a riot. They were ready for teeth and fury and noise, the dangerous animal that bears itself and charges, and they could have crushed that in an afternoon and called it Tuesday. What they were never ready for, what they had no name for and no defense against, was a line of the young standing silent and ranked and certain, waiting without a sound for one old broken thing to tell them it was time. That's the part I think about, not the fighting, the silence before it. 11 cubs holding the line in the worst moment of their lives, holding it not out of fear of me but out of something the Veil had no word for, and I had finally, at the cost of everything, taught them. An old Sore looking down that line and understanding, one heartbeat too late, that he had braced his whole self against the wrong thing. He'd been afraid the cubs would riot. He should have been afraid of how quiet they could be.